Okay, so part 4 of the social selves lecture, I'm going to focus on individualisation, and largely talking about a group of white male European writers that were mostly writing in the 90s and 2000s, sometimes called reflexive modernity theorists, risk society theorists, and this is a kind of more contemporary, although some of it does sound dated already, way of thinking about that kind of notion between agency and structure, how the individual relates to the wider world. And you'll see in the things I'm going to talking about here elements of all the things I've been talking about in the stuff so far, from playing roles to kind of Foucauldian notions of power, and the way the kind of norms and deviance work. So this work in particular, again, as I said, starting in the 90s, was kind of reacting in many ways to globalization, and the ways that therefore that people are socialized differently and therefore start to feel different as people in the world, maybe in compared to previous generations. So we have, Castell's writing about the information age and the network society. Bauman wrote about liquid modernity. Ulrich Beck, I think, is the most prominent one here, risk society. Anthony Giddens wrote about modernity and self-identity. There's a kind of group of theorists that were kind of writing about this stuff. And what they were interested in is that as the world became more global, as we became more interconnected, it seemed, particularly in the West, in the kind of so-called global North, or what we're calling the minority world in this subject, people are becoming more individualized, more anxious, and more precarious. Now, they're feeling more anxious and precarious and scared, I would say in many ways, even though they're probably safer physically than, for the most part, than they've ever been. So this is an interesting kind of juxtaposition here, and it relates to the need for people to be more reflexive, that I'll talk about in a minute. What Beck in particular was interested in here is how science has played a key role in that. I've had the scientific revolution in the 1800s. Science has become much more the way that we understand truth. We moved somewhat away from religion and moved towards science. Again, in the last decade, we could argue whether that's still the case. But as science then has kind of shed more light on humans, on our physiology, on our DNA, also widely more on the earth and the universe, and more on disease and what's good for us and bad for us, and there's kind of expert discourses that I was talking about before. We kind of know, in inverted commas, more and more things about the world, but it hasn't kind of led to more security or more, kind of feeling more secure in our existence. What it seems to have led to is more kind of anxiety about what it means to be a human, more distrustful of knowledge in particular, because we become increasingly skeptical of truth, or we suffer from kind of information overload. Now, in this sense, that kind of notion from religion providing certainty and truth to science providing certainty and truth, we moved into this kind of ambivalence kind of period now where, like, we know science in many ways provides us with kind of more and more understanding, but our understanding of truth has somewhat changed because we know that science keeps making new discoveries about things. So what may be true about something or someone 10 years ago or yesterday may be different tomorrow. I think I've used the example already, something in the course. It's like red wine at one stage is really bad for you, and you read a story tomorrow and having 2 glasses a day might be good for your heart, and then the next day you read something else and it might be, give you cancer or something. And chocolate's another thing that has that kind of stuff all the time. How are we meant to live with this kind of constant bombarding of kind of contradicting information? From this kind of risk society point of view, we're left increasingly anxious and precarious, we're increasingly wary of risks, and it's up to us as individuals to navigate our way through these kind of things. So the very knowledge that Foucault theorised was disciplining us through the freedoms it creates, seems now to be accompanied as much by a kind of general feelings of insecurity and increasing distrust of experts, while we rely on them more than ever before. And again, as I pointed out already, as a paradox here is that kind of most people in the kind of minority world of the global North are probably physically safer than they've ever been. Again, maybe in the last 5 years or so, maybe not so much, but like particularly while these guys were writing. So how can we think about this kind of paradox? What Beck kind of points out, and I think this is a really interesting point, is that we've come to understand that science isn't kind of locked away in test tubes and labs. Science, in effect, is essentially done on the public. Now, of course, when any products or chemicals or foods or whatever are produced, they're tested in labs. And then there's decided on what levels of safety of whatever's going on before they're released out. But it's not really until things are released out in the public and people start consuming them that the real kind of positive or negative, good or bad kind of stuff comes out, and often doesn't come out for years, decades, even centuries, till we find out, for instance, that something might be way bad for us or dangerous than we didn't initially understand. So in this sense, society is a lab. Products are made, they're tested to a certain probability of safety, then they're let out into the world, and we find out what they're really like kind of months, years, decades later. The other thing we don't really understand too is when things go out into the world, we often don't know how they're going to kind of react together, the kind of synergistic effects of how things work. So I mentioned the red wine chocolate thing, good or bad. I think I mentioned the first lecture of asbestos, great thing to build houses out of, and then it gives you cancer. You can think about this in terms of all the diets and workout stuff that happens. Are HIIT workouts, for instance, most efficient for physical fitness, or are we all increasing our chances of having a heart attack? See this through the climate change, production of energy, materials, products that are kind of making us comfortable are also the production of those things leading to environmental destruction and climate change. You can even see things like, the movie recently about Oppenheimer, the scientific achievements of the likes of Einstein leads to the creation of nuclear weapons. So science, therefore, is in this kind of linear progression of things getting better in terms of the way we experience, and therefore we're kind of left in this kind of risky, kind of precarious situation where we don't fully understand what's going on all the time. We have to make our own decisions. What this means for Beck is we're moving from a class society to a risk society. And his kind of famous quip about this is that smog is democratic. And what he means by that is, say, in a rich global city that we've looked at in kind of globalization already, if you're the CEO working in the big office on the top floor, or whether you're the cleaner, cleaning the 50 stories or whatever, if you're living in a global city, you're breathing in smog, whether you're rich or poor. So the kind of effects created by science, the effects created by progress, are affecting people kind of somewhat equally if you think about it through that lens. I think that's kind of true on a very broad sense, but obviously we can criticize that, and we'll look at kind of in Week on Class, for instance, how we'll create some understandings how, smog might be so democratic. I mean, back in the 80s when BHP was in Newcastle, there was a reason why houses were cheap in Mayfield, because that's where most of the smog would settle. So, smog in that sense isn't also always that democratic. But in the same kind of zone, Beck talks about there's a kind of boomerang effect here, that those often that are possessing the wealth and those that benefit most from creating the risks, those that own companies or whatever, are also afflicted by them as well. So there's a kind of boomerang effect. What Beck argues here is we've moved from societies that had a commonality of need around, being hungry or cold in terms of inequalities. And, in that sense, in the Western world, it was seen that we've kind of mostly covered Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but again, we'd fundamentally question that from a sociological point of view. Moving towards more what he called a commonality of anxiety, where we're kind of more anxious and afraid, and really there's a kind of inequality in terms of who gets to be more secure and who gets to face more risks. So in this sense, risk has always existed. There's always been wars, famine, natural disasters. There still is. And there seems to be an increase in natural disasters over the past 20 years. But Beck argues essentially that for the first time in human history, those kind of wars, famines, and natural disasters were always kind of isolated to various places. But what we've done now in the name of progress and through globalization has produced kind of huge risks that could actually wipe us all out. Things like nuclear weapons, things like climate change, things like, the effects of genetically modified food, or the degradation of a kind of energy industry or something could all have kind of huge effects and wipe out whole populations. So for Beck, this realization, these changes have had a fundamental change on how humans think about themselves in the world. Beck and his partner, Elizabeth Beck-Gernsheim, wrote a book called Individualisation. And what they talk about here is that in the realization of this big risk society, what happens is that blame for things increasingly gets pushed on the individual. So if you're unemployed, it's not that there's like no jobs or the kind of labour market has been casualised, or there's been a downturn in the share market and people are getting put off. Normally what happens in those situations is the individual is blamed. You're seen as kind of not job ready, you haven't got the right skills, you need to be more flexible, you need to move. Blame for social problems becomes directed towards individuals, and kind of more structural kind of mechanisms are kind of let off the hook. So again, the kind of quote here, where setbacks had been seen in the past as a blow of fate sent by nature, structure, or God, these events are now considered to be a personal failure, which is reinforced by new forms of institutionalized guilt ascription. This is particularly a case around like the labeling, I suppose, that we were talking about earlier in the lecture. Part of this has been about detraditionalization. People have become increasingly disembedded from family, locality, class, religion. An irony here is kind of one of the things in terms of feminist progression is that more and more women now actually get to work or go to university. This changes the labour market. It's seen kind of casualisation happen as well. But now women not only have to kind of get educated, get a good job, they still have to do all the kind of family stuff. And this means that women in particular are left kind of being increasingly precarious and insecure because of these detraditionalized changes. So again, you can see a kind of governing through freedom element coming through there. What Beck argues, therefore, is how we now live becomes biographical solutions to systemic contradictions. It's up to us as individuals to kind of navigate our way through all these risks and come up with our own strategies to kind of pursue our satisfying life. Even though, under these social, structural, risky circumstances, that's increasingly impossible to do. So in this sense, day-to-day life problems, of which solutions used to be pursued in the realms of politics, community, church, kind of collective ways of kind of trying to fix social problems, they're increasingly left to the market and to be solved by the individual through choice, further education, or whatever the individual has the resources, things like cultural, economic and social capital that we'll talk about later in the course, to be able to do those things. You can see how kind of inequality still works in a similar way, but it's kind of viewed through a different lens. This means that individuals have to be what Beck calls reflexive. And reflexivity happens on a couple of levels. Individuals need to be reflexive, but also societies become more reflexive. If you think about science, for instance, science needs to become reflexive because science creates all of these risks, and then new science has to come to kind of fix the risks that science has already created. There's like a recursive self-fulfilling prophecy going on there. At an individual level, though, reflexivity means that we kind of have to increasingly step outside of our own bodies and make judgments about ourselves, I suppose, to kind of create the best self we can be, whether that's getting a life coach, whether that's going on a diet, whether that's going to get the right degree. We have to increasingly construct ourselves more and more to perform a version of ourselves that's most close to be able to minimize as many risks as possible. So we're kind of forced to weigh up ourselves, we're forced to weigh up advice, we're enforced to weigh up what experts tell us to minimize risk in our lives to become the best person we can. And this is particularly the case because of those established kind of forms of meaning are kind of dwindling, things like religion, for instance, but also how we kind of trust science less and less. So it's up to us to kind of struggle for what Giddens calls ontological security as individuals. And it's really difficult, right? Because we often don't really know whether we're making the right decisions or not. So we have to do this at an individual level to navigate our way through life at the same time where all these kind of risks and uncertainties are still happening. And again, this kind of relates many argue that to the rise of things like mental health issues such as depression and anxiety and stuff like that, that like the force of being reflexive leads to kind of these issues. In comparison, it's argued that in more traditional societies, maybe back in the 50s or something, you were born into the world. To say, you were a white male born into Cessnock, you were pretty much would have to be a coal miner, and this or whatever around there. There wasn't a lot of other options, and your race, gender, and ethnicity and location largely kind of ascribed you a role. As things like progress has happened, as kind of there's been kind of feminist politics and racial discrimination has been attacked and all that kind of stuff, there's more freedom in that sense. But this has also led to this kind of notion of that we have to kind of be reflexive and make our own way now. So the move from a more ascribed script to more open, at least the kind of idea that it is more open, leads to these issues. Now, of course, things like class, gender, and race still hugely prescribe what people can be. But the expectation now is that we've kind of moved beyond, post-race, post-gender kind of inequality, and people are just kind of not good enough or whatever if they don't make it today. So again, this is kind of playing into that reflexive stuff that leads to things like uncertainty, insecurity, and risk. I think I've gone through a fair bit of this stuff already. So another kind of metaphor that Beck uses, I think, in Individualisation, is the idea that maybe our lives have moved from babushka dolls to tightrope walkers. Life in the middle of the 20th century, he argues, are more like those Russian dolls that all fit inside each other. The different kind of norms and meanings we had fit together, and they kind of fitted more closely with what the expectations of broader institutions were. So the example here, married heterosexual couple who would have had children fitted within a model of a full-time paid employment where the man would be the breadwinner and the woman would be the role of the housewife. The economy and the institutions are kind of set up with that norm. So the wife and mother would see the needs of the household while the minimum wage adult man was meant to be enough for a family to survive for the future. Increasingly, that's simply not the case. The model of the family's changed, the model of the workers changed, and certainly the kind of to be able to get by today just to have one breadwinner isn't enough, particularly in a place like Australia where it'd be impossible almost to buy a house in that situation. So while in that old model too, there was kind of still all those inequalities were applying to everyone but kind of straight white middle class males, that certainty provide more kind of security in that sense, even though there was still kind of people experiencing obvious social suffering and oppression. What globalization and kind of changes into our orientation towards truth has done is that this Russian dolls have been kind of pulled apart, and new social arrangements kind of presuppose that the individual is responsible for designing and staging their own lives. So it's less now we kind of following scripts and more that we have to write the script ourselves. So this kind of resonates with the Goffman stuff, the view of the actor playing a different role and staging their own life, but it's kind of less kind of Shakespearean kind of play, a comedy or a tragedy that you kind of follow that script and those roles, and more like an improvisation that you kind of have to act out as things are going. So Beck, therefore, is kind of talking about how modern lives are more like Russian dolls, less like Russian dolls and more like tightrope walkers and jugglers. Instead of these roles holding together, they're contradictory, they lack reference to each other and other roles you play in your life. What seems to be kind of form of freedom, women in the workforce getting to have actual careers, adds to the kind of ways that roles became more uncertain because they still have all the kind of usual traditional expectations of that role as well. It's just kind of one example of this contradictory way of thinking about things. Okay, so to sum up, so note how these ideas resonate with some of the kind of readings in the book about the mestiza consciousness and the global south scholars as well. There shouldn't be making any false equivalence here, though. The contradictory demands placed on those in the global south are more stark and violent than the more existential demands in the minority world. So that's a kind of really important thing to consider here, that much of the risk in the risk society that Beck's talking about are more existential anxieties than actual physical risks that many in the global south are still facing. We need to therefore, in the kind of minority world, we're increasingly juggling these multiple demands. We're told that we live in this meritocratic world where you need to make the right choices to kind of be satisfied and happy, but all those kind of traditional inequalities still persist in affecting the very possibility of that. As I think we write about in the book, Lauren Ballan has an interesting, I think, concept to think about this, which is the concept of cruel optimism. We all want to pursue a good life, But there's so many kind of false promises made to us, about meritocracy and freedom and all that kind of stuff, that cruel optimism is this kind of exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. What Balan's pointing out there is many of the things we're kind of encouraged to chase, whether that's kind of wealth or things or particular jobs or whatever, are not really kind of our true needs. They're more like wants, and pursuing them in a world that's increasingly unequal or has more and more cost of living demands may actually be a detrimental to our flourishing. So we'll kind of look at more aspects of this through different lenses throughout the course. In the next few weeks, I think we're looking at media and digital stuff that's particularly important for promoting the kind of idea of various examples of the good life. And then we'll be looking at specific forms of inequality around class, gender, and race. Thanks.